חציו השם וחציו לשם שמיים, כמו סופה מן הים עולם, כמו תופעה של מרים פועם, ואין תרופה בעולם ללב. ורק אתה יכול תוך מסגדי למחול, לזכך את החול, לרכך בי הכל. ורק אתה מבין איך לגשת ללב שלי, משכך כל כאב שבי, מרפא את הלב.
Welcome everybody to this stupendous occasion, the Articulation series, where art is formed in Torah and Torah informs art. Today we have an incredible convergence of minds, a chavruta pairing that have studied together for many years. And today we have presented in front of us the work, the Torah and the art that has emerged from this process about Parshat Naso. We have Rabbi Bronwen Mullen, a Philadelphia native, received a BA in Theater and Religious Studies from Sarah Lawrence College, an MA in Midrash and Rabbinic Ordination from the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. Her organizational affiliations include the Conservative Yeshiva of Jerusalem, the Shalom Hartman Institute, and so on and so on. She's extremely integrated in so many Jewish worlds and brings so much beauty and identity with Judaism, the queer community, art, and love, and all of the above. We also have presented in front of us the fantastic artist Beth Achenbach from Jersey City. She's well known for her still life photography, but Beth also creates digital and multimedia art as well. Her work has been exhibited in solo and group art events throughout New Jersey and New York over the past 20 years. In 2014, she was honored by Hudson County for her work in the arts and LGBTQ communities. Without further ado, Rabbi Bronwen, would you please present this week's Parsha for us?
Hi, everyone. It is so wonderful that we all get to be together. I'm particularly excited. I just arrived back from about 6 months in Israel, Palestine, just 24 hours ago. So very excited to be back on Eastern time in the US. Like, hello, everybody. So this parasha, this section of the Torah reading is known as Parshat Naso, which literally means to lift up, essentially as we lift up. And we're in the middle of the book of Numbers in the Hebrew Bible, and people may be familiar that the book of Numbers is actually referred to as Bamidbar. That's its original Hebrew name, meaning in the wilderness. And so all of these chapters that sort of come up in the book of Numbers, that come up in this text known as Bamidbar, are about what happens in the wilderness. And so it's kind of ironic to say that for many a rabbi who is writing sermons, also known as Divrei Torah or Devar Torah, word of Torah, on the book of Numbers, on Bamidbar in the wilderness, it's a bit of a wilderness in many ways because it's not always the most interesting material. It's not full of narratives the way that the book of Genesis is. It's not like the book of Exodus that has, the great liberation narrative that's informed so many aspects of multiple religious cultures. It's more akin to what we find in the book of Leviticus, which is a number of laws, a number of accountings. And the book of Numbers is especially well known for censuses. There's a lot of accountings of the numbers of people, of the Israelites who were there. And just to be real, this has never been particularly interesting material, certainly for me as a rabbi. the accounting of these numbers. I know, Beth, you're laughing at me. This is all your fault. You've ruined it for me forever. It's not particularly the most interesting material, historically, for me, certainly. And not just as a rabbi, but as a Jew in the pew. I'm like, oh, great. You're reading along, as someone's reading from the Torah, and you're like, oh, gosh, when is Kiddush, right? When's the lunch break? But all of this is to say is that even in the book of Numbers, where we are in Parshat Naso, this actually does have some really interesting material that's not particularly narrative. It's not a story, but it has two particularly interesting cases. One is a case known as the Sotah, which means it's the accused woman. And it's a story, really it's a situation in which we find out that there's a woman who is accused of infidelity by her husband. And she's brought through to actually the elders of the community to undergo a kind of water ritual, which some people have critiqued and noticed it's very similar to a witch trial, in which this ritual is designed to prove whether she's innocent or guilty of this infidelity. Immediately after that story is also the case of the Nazir. People may be familiar, by the way, sort of the term Nazirite, meaning one who is literally from Nazareth, but not always. But a Nazir is one who refrains or takes on certain ascetic practices, such as refraining from cutting one's hair or shaving or drinking wine or engaging in sexual relations. And the Nazir, in this case, is one of the few times where an ascetic life practice is actually lauded in Jewish texts. We don't really have so much of asceticism in Judaism at large. So these two stories these two cases are particularly interesting in a book that's mostly a wilderness, so to speak, of interesting material. And their juxtaposition next to each other is also particularly fascinating. So, of course, in beginning to study Parshat Naso with Beth, who I am honored as an artist I deeply admire and as a friend, very dear friend, that I'm so excited to do this material with her because surely a photographer and performance artist is going to have a lot to say about these two pieces. But of course, Beth was interested in the census at the beginning of Parashat Naso, right? And in those opening verses, that's where we get an accounting of these different clans of the house of Levi, of the Levites. And so it's the numbers of males over the age of 30. And it's an accounting of all the different material pieces that make up the tent of meeting and the tabernacle, right? So those are the English terms. The tent of meeting in Hebrew is referred to as the Ohel Moed, and the tabernacle, known in Hebrew as the Mishkan, these sort of two meeting places where God's presence was really believed to be there, and all the material requirements that it took to actually build both of those spaces, to build it, then to dismantle it, and then to be able to carry it. Hence that term naso, to carry from place to place where the Israelites would encamp. So these opening verses of Parshat Naso go through all of these different clans and what those materials are that each clan is individually responsible for setting up, taking down, and moving from place to place. I guess you could say it would sort of be like a stage manager's fantasy, right? Like, oh, good, there's my tradition in this Torah. This would never have been material that had jumped out to me if not for Beth's excitement about it. Beth's approach to it was actually of real fascination and wonderment about, well, wow, there were all of these people, 600,000 Israelites who have to come to this particular space. This space must have been larger than life. And in full disclosure, and maybe this reveals a little bit of my cynicism, I sort of took that point for granted. I think really up until this chavruta, this learning partnership with Beth. Yeah, like, of course, it's large. I mean, yeah, so what? Like, yeah, I mean, yeah, I guess there's a lot of them. And, next point, right? But that wasn't enough for Beth. So we started on a process of Google imaging, really how did artists and biblical historians view what the tent of meeting and what the Mishkan, this tabernacle, might have actually looked like. And in fact, it is really gigantic. There's two effective large courtyards. There are several fire pits going on at the same time because remember, this is the locus not only for the sacrificial system, which is the central aspect of prayer at this time, but it's also the locus in which religious cases, when there's a matter of questions of purity or impurity, when there's a death, when there's a questionable about leprosy, when you're bringing special offerings and sacrifices for the holidays, everything is located here. When God's presence is present in the form of a cloud or fire, it starts actually at this tent of meeting. It starts in this large-scale courtyard of events. Everything is located here. Everything happens right here. And when we started looking at images of it, it was, in many ways, it was sort of chaotic, a collage of things. So much happening at the same time. It was, in many ways, really overwhelming. And that's when Beth introduced this idea that has really effectively changed the way that I think I'll ever look at this material ever again. And then I'll turn it over to her so you can go through what her process was and look at her amazing artwork. But Beth described it as a circus. That it must have been like a circus, right? With all these different sort of acts going on at the same time, the performativeness of it, the spectacle of it, the fact that it had to announce itself, that it had to be a certain kind of mass appeal and excitement and intention. Everyone could come and had their different aspects, the different things that would call them to that event. And when Beth introduced the idea of circus, I had this total reaction in my body and really a rejection of it. I was like, wait a minute. Like, circuses are superficial. Circuses are places of, animals and kind of mess and muck. And of course, Beth quite accurately noted, well, there were a lot of animals in the circus. It's a pretty messy place. There's a lot of fire. There's a lot of lights and flash, and there's the special acts and the things that feel like they're from the extremes and the poles of society that all of a sudden are brought into the center. Well, the more that she pushed on this and the more that we sort of unrelentingly played with this idea of circus, I realized my total discomfort with this was this idea that I'm like, but the circus isn't holy, it's performance. But how could I, as a rabbi and an artist and a theater artist, somehow think of performance as somehow being unholy? And so in the process of this learning with Beth, and I would like to give this over to you, Beth, if you're happy to jump in, was this realization that there is kind of a discomfort with the way that our rituals can be performative. But perhaps what's in there to discover is, well, why did we choose this kind of a medium, something like akin to a circus, to be the place where the locus of God in the camp would dwell? So at this, I'd like to give this over to you, Beth, to show what you came up with, which was amazing.
Well, I just want to say, because when we first started our first meeting, Rabbi Bronwen was so excited about the sota ritual, because I know you have a background in that, right? You've been very interested in that. And I actually said, I'm very uncomfortable with this ritual where the woman has to drink the bitter waters. And I think I was the one that said it's almost like a witch trial, because there's like, if she's guilty, she gets this big belly on, right? And something about a thigh sagging, which I've yet to understand. Maybe you can say something about that. But, and when you see my image, I sort of kind of created this like woman on a tight wire, because she really is left to, some luck in some ways. And that bitter water that they give her is not nice. It's actually dirt from the ground where the tent of the meeting is inside. So if you think, and this is where we got hung up when we started talking about the mass of people, and I said, all those animals that were sacrificed all walked in there. And if you think of anything that comes along with an animal, that comes out of an animal, is all in the ground on that dirt, and that's what they make her drink. So I had this idea that we should, do an image of pulling back the curtain and just having not really a glimpse in, but you wanting to glimpse in, because all the answers to your questions are in there. The curiosity that you have, or maybe you're not curious and it's too much and you want to turn away, but just a little bit of opening says so much. And also I was thinking about this today. A few months ago, somehow, you know how things happen on Google. You go in somewhere, you're looking up something, and you come across something totally different that you didn't mean to. And I came across this circus poster of a woman just hanging on to some reins, and there's a bunch of horses. It was beautiful. And most of you probably know that circus posters are an art form, and they're very collectible. And I printed that out, and I didn't know what I was going to do with it, but I just felt something strong about it. So when this came up, and I even showed DeVere and Bronwen the poster because it just happens to be on my shelf, it all made sense that poster was probably the beginning of this process. So I also created a digital poster that's inside the photograph. So the image is actually like 3 or 4 actual photographs that I took that I had to stitch together, and then the poster that I fit inside of a frame. And there's a little bit of smoke coming from inside, which was a little fun thing that I did in my bathroom with some with a piece of black poster board hanging up in my bathroom, and a sage stick. But you can see in the poster, I got some ideas off of the other posters, the circus posters that I found. This, the great tent of the 13 tribes, a marvelous display of animals and living curiosities, no extra charge. And it's funny that when I was looking, and Bronwen and I did look at some other circus posters, a lot of these sayings really hit the mark on what we were talking about. And so we have Gershon, the strong man, because the Gershonites were one of the tribes of men of the 13 tribes that actually had to carry, their job, I believe, was to carry the tapestries and a lot of the hardware that went with putting up this gigantic tent. So they had to have all been like these big, and again, you think of these big, strong guys that you imagine worked with the circuses as they traveled from town to town, which is what they were doing. The Israelites were traveling from place to place, and whenever they went, this tent had to go up, and I'm sure it had to go up quickly because they needed to be able to do their sacrifices, and Moses had to talk to God. And you'll see in the middle there, I named the tight wire act bitter water for the bitter water that she had to drink. And I made the Nazir, I kind of purposely made it sort of kind of non-binary. It could be a man or it could be a woman, because those that took the vow actually surprised me that both men and women could take the vow. And I made them a fire breather, partly because there was a lot of fire going on in the tent. Not that they were necessarily in the tent, but because there was a purity to them. And that was the point of it. And fire, they say purifies. So that was my reasoning there. And in the very background, very lightly, you can see a bunch of tents behind the yellow background. That's actually a picture of the tent of meeting. I didn't create it, so I didn't want to put it in the forefront. So those little tents are all the tribes, and they're all placed around the tent of meeting in specific order. I don't know if that, Bronwen, do you know if that had to do with what their jobs were, or it was just their hierarchy?
I think that's a great question, because in the previous parsha we also get sort of a layout, right, of where all the basically where all the different tribes are in location towards the tent of meeting. And it's funny, I've always been under the assumption that the primary role that has to do with the tent of meeting is the Levites themselves, but we actually don't get a total account of where they set up their flag, because their territory is the tent of meeting itself. I'm not really sure about what the other tribes' relationship is to their proximity to the temple. If anyone has ideas about that, please.
I think I had, I had printed out some depictions of that. And I don't see Levites. There's a tent for Moses and there's a tent for Aaron.
Right.
So would the Levites would be in that tent?
I don't know. I think these are really, that's been one of the most like sort of humbling aspects of this, is realizing that in these particular aspects of these parshiot, of these sections, I don't have a really great sense of where the Levites are, because one of the big issues about the Levites in general is that they don't really have an inheritance in the land the way that the other tribes do, right? And we start to see that because they're supposed to effectively belong to the temple and the temple service. So even in the wilderness, it doesn't seem like they also get particularly their own portion. What makes this, for me anyway, now a little bit interesting as we're talking about Circus, is the idea that when you're a member of the Circus, just like you were saying, like you're traveling around from place to place, you don't really have a home of your own. Where is your home? Right? Like where's your trailer? Like where do you get to set up, like, where, you make your coffee and you have your bed at night, right? Like it's sort of, I get the sense in the Circus or the traveling tent theater movement, like your home becomes at one with the performance space. So I wonder to what degree that was also true for the Levite. Like, did they sleep over in the theater? Do they sleep in the courtyard? Is that where their tents are? I'm not really sure.
Well, so there's a thing here that says Levites, but it's just a dot right above the tent of meeting. My finger keeps moving from one place.
Wow.
They're a little dot because there's only, well, no, there's 23,000 of them. When you think of it, I mean, it's still, when you think of it, when you read the numbers of these, of how many people were there, you just can't fathom it. And I think that's why we got stuck.
Right.
That's why we got stuck reading this parsha there, because quite honestly, I've read this part, right? We read this parsha every year, and you and I have done this parsha together. And whenever I come across these censuses, I kind of just skim over them usually. But when we were talking, we really got like stuck on this, and what you like to really envision what that many people and that many animals and that many children, because the children aren't even in the count,
right,
of the 600,000.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Right, like the idea of like having so many kids running around. Right.
And were they trying to peek in the tent? Like they...
See, that's the thing that it's, I mean, just to say something else about the image, why I love this image so much is that, like, the idea that the tent of meeting and the tabernacle, the Ohel Moed and the Mishkan, were both so close and yet so far from the average Israelite. Just that the curtain is right there. It's like you feel like you could just poke through, except that it's also this very dangerous location, right? That if you violate a certain boundary, I mean, really, God can erupt in the Torah, right? Like we have that in the book of Leviticus, right? That God actually kills the two sons of Aaron, right? Because they bring the wrong kind of sacrifice into the central location at the wrong time. So there's just, it is really kind of unfathomable, the idea that you could have this, on the one hand, this extremely exciting place at the center of the camp, and yet at the same time, this extremely volatile place in the center of the camp. I mean, like, feels like, yeah, like children make mistakes. Don't children run into the wrong place at the wrong time all the time?
Well, I wonder how really special it might have been for the average Israelite on the boundaries of the camp to actually go to the tent if they have to offer, bring a sacrifice to offer. Like how big of a deal it actually was for them to go there.
Well, that's sort of the funny thing, right? Like on the one hand, that's a great question. Like on the one hand, it's very regular, right? Like because there are these, so the book of, and this is also kind of an interesting thing, this giving some thought about this, is that the book of Leviticus is really where all things tent of meeting and Mishkan come up, right? Like that's where we get all the different kind of sacrifices and when you do them and who does them. There's the daily offering, there's the sin offering, there's the gratitude offering. There's actually an offering that you bring after childbirth. There's all sorts of things that happen in the temple itself. The rules around the leper, right? That when you bring someone who's suspected of leprosy into the tent and where they go afterwards. Similarly, if there's an object that potentially is infected with leprosy or something sort of that nature. It all happens in the book of Leviticus. Even the descriptions of what the Mishkan and what the Ohel Moed are made of actually happens both in Leviticus but also at the end of Exodus. So there's something funny about it. It feels like being brought up in Deuteronomy, when like sort of the flash and the circumstance of it, its building, its construction, and everything that happens there really happens at the end of Exodus and Leviticus. By the time we're in Numbers, this is just kind of like how Israelites do. It's just like the book of Numbers is really about, like, in many ways, kind of the regular existence that happens of the Israelites as they move from place to place. And then and not even just, I'm not sure we would call this regular, but it's almost like it's the less miraculous aspect of what it means to be God's people. We get down to like the nitty gritty where it's like, yeah, God said you're going to go into this land. Well, you have to conquer it, and God said that you're going to have this, this land that you're going to operate as a people. Well, now you have to divide it. And does everyone get an equal share? All of these promises are being made to be freed from Egypt and be God's people. But, so to speak, Egypt is not the only enemy out there, right? There's a lot you're going to face. So there's something very day to day and mundane about the book of Numbers, right? Also named for the censuses, right? The book of Bamidbar, being in the wilderness, trudging around.
I think your attitude is just I think we talked about it. It's kind of like the ho-hum of day-to-day living, and like we do with our job, like I got to go to work tomorrow. And this was what the census is, what these jobs are for these men.
Yeah.
Of these different tribes, and they, I guess Numbers is them, working out their muscle memory of what they're going to do, and it wouldn't be daily, right? Because I'm sure they didn't camp day by day. They must have stayed in one place for a little bit,
right? No,
like a circus,
right? At least for some period of time. I just want to say, by the way, I saw in the chat that I think Shalhevet said that I feel like Numbers is super dramatic. Oh, see, this is why we're going to get into the discussion. We're going to get into this. I want to hear what other people think, because clearly I have my own bias against the book of Numbers. But now I feel like it must be super dramatic because there was, it's interesting, right? There are, and just to qualify, I want to hear it. Shalhevet, is it possible for you to get off?
Hi, I'm Shalhevet, she, her.
Hi.
It's great to chime in for these, like, I can only pop in for like a short little bit. So it's great to just pop in to hear your beautiful Torah. And this is just like so cool. Wow, what an honor to be here. Yeah, I think you're right in that the Book of Numbers does span a really huge swath of time, in that we start out in the first year, we're basically on the cusp of entering Eretz Yisrael. It's really exciting. And the bulk of the book deals with the very end, how Moshe Rabbeinu is no longer going to be the one leading the people in, but they're kind of getting ready to enter. They're starting to conquer the lands of the Me'aver LeYarden for Reuven, Gad, Chatzi, Shevet, Menashe, but kind of in part of that tumult of the very end of the book, there is a lot of people vying for power. I kind of feel like it's almost like a teenager trying to figure out their place in the world. And the way the teenager is trying to do it is to figure out, how much power should I have or shouldn't I have? What's my role? I want to be a leader, but I also want to find my place. And I think there are lots of people who try to be in the public eye and do so pretty unsuccessfully, like Korach and Bilam and Balak. And there are people who find a way to make it through. But it's, I think, a long and circuitous journey, kind of like the ups and downs of being a teenager. So I don't know, this is all to say that, yeah, like there's a lot of stuff that really isn't super dramatic, like living a pleasant, quaint nomadic life in the desert for 40 years. Yeah, that's pretty mellow. But at least the dramatic stories of these characters, oof, how they try to usurp power, it's like, whoa, this is spicy. That's my feeling. I don't know.
Right, spicy bell.
That's amazing, Shavit. Thank you for saying that. It's, a lot of this is about really like revealing my own biases about Bamidbar, but this is also like, this is kind of what's so great about Torah study, right? And especially doing it from an artistic perspective, is that when we're really doing our job with Torah, it should be this mirror onto ourselves. So you're totally right, Shavit, that there really are these very dramatic stories in Bamidbar, very much about power. That's absolutely true. It's like, and for anyone who just doesn't know that, so Korach is actually a figure, believe it or not, who's also a descendant of the Levites, which is sort of interesting considering that we're talking about the Levites now. Korach actually challenges Moses and says, "Who said you're the only prophet around here? Aren't we all supposed to be a nation of prophets?" Right? And Korach actually attempts to basically usurp Moses of his power, and it becomes this really dramatic showdown where effectively Korach and all of his band of supporters are swallowed up by the earth. Then there's also the famous story that shall have it referenced about Bilam, the prophet, who Balak, a local king, says, go curse the Jewish people. And when Bilam attempts to do so, his donkey actually all of a sudden gains the power of speech and starts, really telling him, "What are you doing? You've beat me all these years, and have I ever done anything wrong to you?" And effectively, Bilam becomes unable to curse the Jewish people. So there's really, there is a lot of interesting stuff about power in this parsha. And I'll just say that for me, I think the reason that Bamidbar sort of always struck me as being non-dramatic, maybe it's not even that it's not dramatic, but it's like maybe it's that the kind of drama in it feels mundane to me, which is maybe a sad thing to say then. And maybe, again, that's a little bit about my own cynicism, and maybe it's about the world we live in. And I'm like, oh yeah, people fighting for power, right? Like, like, oh, like this person wants to curse somebody else. And like, there's something so just maybe in my heart is a little bit like, oh, like the everyday evils of people. Oh, no big deal. But like maybe one shouldn't feel that way, but like that we should remind ourselves, like, actually, like, we shouldn't get too comfortable with that kind of drama. Like there's actually a problem there.
Like gun violence right now. And I don't think anyone's comfortable, but sometimes you see it's like, oh, another shooting. Oh no. Like you feel you're helpless.
My gosh.
But also, on a different subject, a talking donkey is not mundane.
No. Yeah, right. Exactly.
It goes in the circus.
I mean, look, my wife tells our cats all the time to use their words, so we should never take an animal speaking as being mundane. That's definitely true. I'm also seeing from Kay in the chat, just reading, says, we're given a beautiful vision of a sustainable future at the end of Leviticus, right? Then with Bamidbar, we face the everyday challenges, right, of trying to implement the vision. It is hard, and we immediately shift into bureaucratic mode. I think that's really it. Okay, that's kind of what I think often feels to me about the book of Bamidbar is this. It is this kind of bureaucracy, and then leaning into what Shalhevet was saying is that like, and then the other side sort of bureaucracy, right, are these kind of power grabs. So all of that to say is that sort of in the midst of all of that, oh, thank you so much for coming, shall have it. I'm gonna say goodbye. But that in the midst of that, this whole this circus piece is just so haunting. And anyhow, I just want to say because so Beth, you brought us down this like wild path of circus. So I had to sort of investigate. I'm like, well, how does circus relate to all this and this idea of sort of thinking about this space as being the stage in which ritual and our morality, our ethics, our values sort of come to life. I ended up doing a deep dive in sort of how Jewish tradition has looked at circus. And what's really interesting is that there's a lot of tension around the concept of circus. And that was one of the sort of the big explorations. And so when looking at a number of Talmudic sources, on the one hand, there's sort of a camp that in general, or rather I should say the broadest camp is that circus is viewed as the thing that non-Jews do. But to be extremely specific, and this is why, because this can sound like we're getting into a very sort of like ethnophobic and kind of like ethno-hierarchical sort of attitude. What's interesting in the context of the Talmud is that circus is very particularly associated with the Romans, who were the occupying force in Israel, Palestine at that time, right? Which means that circus is, so just to translate that on a sort of a more macro level, that circus was very much associated as like the locus of power. It's the entertainment of the people in power. And circus was, particularly their version of circus was really associated with gladiators, was really associated with violence and kind of playing out violence for sport, which I'm now realizing is also actually very interesting in relations to sort of what Shalhevet was saying, that, you know, we're talking about power plays, right? Well, circus in sort of the rabbinic, the Talmudic mind, these are sort of the early generations, as we're talking roughly 3rd century BCE up through the 9th century CE. So we're talking a 1200 year period roughly, in which circus was kind of the symbol of sort of where power was played with by the people in power. The other thing about circus in terms of the rabbinic mind in the Talmud is that this was the place where sacrifices took place, sacrifices to foreign gods. So it's interesting that for them, circus was a place where power was played with and sort of violence was this location, and religious ritual took place. So generally speaking, there's this discomfort with Jews going to the circus in rabbinic material, so much so that in the Jerusalem Talmud, there are two versions of the Talmud, one from Babylon, one from Jerusalem. The Jerusalem Talmud actually says that the biblical figure Ruth, who we may be familiar with, who's sort of one of the people who's sort of famous for converting to Judaism in the rabbinic tradition, is actually advised in her process to not go to the circus, that Jewish girls do not go to the circus. In a section of Talmud known as Avodah Zarah, or foreign worship, we're told that specifically that the circus is a location where these sort of ritual sacrifices would take place. And even if your government, and it's really also an interesting thing that apparently, according to the rabbinic imagination, that sometimes communal events were called upon, like communal, not just communal events, but events dealing with communal affairs took place within these Roman circuses themselves. And that if you were called to go into the circus when an act of foreign worship was taking place, that even though it was a matter of community affairs of the whole community, that you were forbidden to go. That you could actually only enter a circus if commanded to, right? If you like had to, during a time when there wasn't foreign worship happening there. And there's yet even another story about a famous rabbi who at one point fell into so much debt that he had to sell himself as a gladiator into the circus. The figure was Reish Lakish. So it's clear that there's a lot of tension in sort of early rabbinic material around what circus is. But then I found this really, really wild commentary. And so this comes from a rabbi named Rabbeinu Bachya, 13th century, and he's making a sort of a broader comment about the role of the Mishkan, the tabernacle in general. But then I found this particular piece where he asks a sort of open question. He says, I guess a sort of broad question, which is that why is it that whenever there's a people trying to conquer the Israelites or trying to conquer the Jews, that they always destroy the temple? Why is the temple always the locus? Which is actually a question I've had students over the years ask me as well, and it's worth thinking about, like, why go after this? Why the temple in particular? And he explains it by means of an analogy. He says, well, it's just like when you have one king who wants to fight and conquer another king, but instead they know that, but because they secretly know that they actually can't defeat that other king, that instead they go to the circus of that ruler and they fight and defeat the other gladiators there. They show their physical strength there. So get this. So then he continues the analogy and says, so too, that's why when these other conquering nations, and again, he's mostly talking about Rome here, but talking about other sort of groups throughout Jewish history have sort of aimed to destroy the Jewish people, says that's why they go into the temple, because they know they can't actually defeat God, but rather they try to basically attack the Jews through their temple itself. So what was just amazing about that text was that Rabbeinu Bachya actually spells out this exact analogy that, Beth, that I think you put forward and that we've been exploring, which is that he also acknowledges that there's something about the temple, there's something about the tent of meeting, and there's something about the tabernacle that are sort of this circus-like performance locus for what it means to be in interaction with God. And I guess the question that still feels very alive for me, and I still I'm still trying to, I'm wrestling with it, and your poster really actually helps me the most with it, is just this idea of like where is the place of the Sotah and the Nazir in this whole circus-like thing, and why them? Why here? Like, why is this coming up in Bamidbar in the wilderness and not in Leviticus where we're getting all these technicalities? Like, something feels particularly circus-like about this material here, I think. Does that resonate? Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, because it's like all of a sudden there's these oddities, like life's going on, but it's like, oh, let's pick out this one thing. And it's I don't know if I'm wrapping my brain around it. I just want, it's people that are different, because we're also talking in this parsha about the lepers, or anyone that's unclean has to be put out on the outskirts. Yeah, I think I might need your help here.
No, I'm with it.
Uh,
No, but I think that's kind of the key, is like just what you said, like this idea that focusing on these sort of two figures who are sort of at the outskirts, it's like I just wonder if there's something to be said about the idea that we're getting this reintroduction to these sort of extremes of lived experience, and a reminder about sort of what it takes to have this sort of central, exciting, flashy thing in the center of camp. It just, it feels, I don't know how to say it. It's like, it feels like it's trying to say, like, don't think that what happens here at this like holy circus is just spectacle to a God you can't see. That it's also going to be made of like sort of the messiness of regular human experience, of when you have feelings of jealousy, when you respond in extreme ways, or where we're looking for ways to be pure, and we're which can take us to extremes, right? Whatever our sense of purity means. I'm
Sure.
also Kay in the chat says, They are vow makers, as we all are. Right, exactly. We all go through this process of vow making, and they give us a model of the fate of vow breakers. Wow, it's really like,
Okay.
ugh, ugh. This is this
I
is what,
wonder if some people would go into the tent hoping to get a glimpse of God. Like there, and there's that, like,
right.
or hear him. And at the end of the parsha, Moses goes in when it's all up and done, and he goes into the Mishkan to talk to God. Do you think I'm curious, when that happens, is that when the day is done? When are there people still within the tent and things happening?
Mm.
Because in Exodus we can't listen, the Israelites can't hear God. His voice is too damaging, right, to our ears.
Yeah.
So there's, to me, there's just all the things we're unsure about and so curious about. And we read the Torah like
Again,
onward and onward, it keeps going, it always going, but there's always something that we're not sure of.
I think that's
right?
it.
And it's in there.
That's right. I think you're right. I think they are. I think there is like, well, this is that thing, right? It's like, yeah, there's a hope. There is somehow an irrepressible hope to get that glimpse of God, right? Like we all sort of want that, right? And yet we also sort of know that it's impossible, right? So that Kay put in chat, right, that yeah, only Moses and Aaron get to actually go into the tent itself. Exactly. And so like we know that, like we know that our heart, like that's again why the circus thing is so compelling, and also why it was haunting me is that like the circus invites you to see something that normally you can't see, or you shouldn't see, or somehow provocative to see, or is maybe there's even a part of it's almost like wrong to see, right? That's also sort of the appeal of it, right? Like one shouldn't see this, and yet that's what lures you in. That's the whole. It's like you want it, but you should. And also they do that when you're in the city. There are things you see, but there are also things you don't see. There are back areas. We don't see exactly where the lions come from. We don't see, where the performers like get in their makeup or their illusion, right? What's seen and what's unseen. Like circus very much relies on that, and yeah, it's an
And you need some sort of ticket to get in. You have to, you can't just go in there willy-nilly, right? You have to be presenting a sacrifice.
right. That's right. There has to be a specific thing that brings you there.
Right.
This is so amazing.
You gotta have a ram or a bird or a
yeah, exactly
or
right.
there's the there's a grain sack. There's a grain, right?
Exactly. There are different kinds of tickets that buy you admission. Exactly.
Oh my God. Well, should we open it up to see if anyone else wants to say anything?
Please. I know we have about 10 minutes left. We'd love to get questions and thoughts and just get in discussion. It can be about the artwork, the parsha, anything that's coming up for y'all.
Yes. Karen, you have a question.
There. Rolling, this is fantastic. It's really, it's so rich. And I don't know, I've never conceptualized it that way. But one of the things that I was thinking about, it's kind of rolling it back to Shalhevet and the whole notion of power. And some of it is kind of, and back to Beth, your like beginning thoughts of census. And some of it is just structural. When you look at the censuses, like who gets counted, there's definitely a power towards a Levite, even though they were a smaller cohort. You start counting Levites from the infants, from the children. So there's a kind of privilege which is built in to their role, into the way they count, and into what they do. So I thought that was really interesting. And in a way, they're very central. And then you have you have the witnesses, or you have, you know, the tribes around who are spectators or whatever in this metaphor. But it's fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. Who do you think the ringmaster is?
Yeah, that is a good question. Who is the ringmaster? Because part of me wants to. It's funny because I feel like my gut would have been Moses, but then
Aaron.
I think Aaron.
Aaron. Yeah.
And it makes me wonder if there's also a little tension there, you know, in the sense that like this area really is Aaron's domain. It's
Right.
not Moses's.
Mm-mm. Mm-mm.
Love some good structure. Thank you for that, Karen. Woo.
Here we go.
Kay, you have your hand up. What would you like to ask?
Yeah, I did. Beth had raised earlier about where the Levites lived, you know, where do they dwell in this whole thing? And so last week in Bamidbar, we had the layout of all the other tribes around the outside, so they march together in there. And then in this one, very specifically, when they start the count of the Levites, they tell you where the Levites within the heart of the camp are posted. And there's some to the east and some to the south, depending on what their jobs are and what things they're schlepping, so that they put the less dangerous stuff toward the outside of their section. And the more you get into the heart, the more dangerous, because the more that's at stake. And so I think this question of even division within the people who have power, we're constantly reminded that that's a really heavy burden, that it's they have such responsibilities that nobody else gets hurt due to their inability to protect, or due to their oversight, or due to their making a flat mistake like Nahab and Abihu did, you know. And I think as you get into that power layer, it's not just, well, we're outside the power, we're inside the power. Who's capable to bear that kind of power as a human being? And you have to train your whole life for that. So I think, you know, it's so fascinating to me at this very beginning, when they're starting to take up new responsibilities, a bunch of people who've never had responsibilities at all, except to stay out of the way of the taskmaster's whip, you know, and eat when they're supposed to, that sort of stuff. To watch this responsibility for wielding great power, wielding great closeness to God, how that starts to evolve within our people. Do we ever get to a point where it really worked well? I don't think so. But at least it has kept us on a track for a long time that has served to become a blessing to the world. And I hope that these guides continue to make us that after the circus.
Thanks, Kay.
That's really amazing to think about bearing the responsibility when you really haven't had that experience of bearing the responsibility. And it's really, that's such a great image, Kay. I think the thing I'm mulling over is like, they're bearing this responsibility. And like, I love the image that you said about sort of avoiding the taskmaster's whip. Like, that's your number one responsibility. And then here, though, and it's kind of similar, right? It's just that they can't see the taskmaster. You know, like, what's going to, I mean, or is it, or like, or if there isn't, if we're not going to call God that, you know, and that, you know, has its own problem, you know, obviously it can be very problematic. But just the idea of that, like, what in the creation of this sort of giant circus-like structure, what are we serving? Like, yes, we've been told that it's God, but like in these, like specifically in Bamidbar, like with these cases of like the Sotan, the Nazir that are specifically mentioned, like, it feels like in neither of those cases are we really it's not about serving God in those moments. It's not like God is accusing the woman of infidelity, or that God is demanding that this Nazir like take on these like. It's like, on the one hand, the circus belongs to God, and on the other hand, the circus really belongs to the people. Like, yeah, so yeah, like, yeah, whose responsibility are we bearing? Maybe both. I don't know.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Mm.
I had the chance to sit in on some really amazing Shavuot studies this week, and I kept being blown away by the insights people had, but also by, in some cases, what huge anger people carried with them toward having to obey commandments, you know? And I kept wondering if it wouldn't be much healthier for us if we stopped calling them commandments. I mean, call them mitzvot if you want, but consider them more like a recipe, you know? Here's a recipe for a world that's going to turn out like fabulous, right? Now, you guys can do it. You know, if you don't, you don't, you know, right? Because I think it completely loses the idea of the breach. It's an easy way to say, oh, I don't have anything to do with this because somebody's telling me to do it. Well, no, I agree to do this. And I'm going to try to bake the cake, or, you know, call it a user's manual, call it whatever you want, but make that set of gifts that we got through the Torah that says this is how things work, you know, and you don't want to do it, okay, but guess what? Other stuff it's not gonna work if you don't do this stuff, you know. And I mean, we're seeing that so much now. It seems to be sort of a mass breakdown of cultural values with you know, people going out shooting each other and shooting children and all this kind of stuff. Why go there? We've got a great recipe, you know. Hang in with the recipe. Take care of each other. Love each other. Love God, you know. Not hard things to do. Most of these mitzvot are not hard to do. But if we just want to build up an anger that says, I'm not going to do it because you told me to, that's kind of like, I didn't do my homework and the teacher doesn't like me sort of thing. So I think it just makes me sad when people turn their backs on the wonderful gift we've been given, and then it takes them their whole lives to figure out, well,
I mean, life is much easier if you just, you know,
yeah.
If you go, well, I don't want to say the wrong thing, go along or follow the rules or whatever, but if you follow the recipe, you're going to have great cookies, right? And, you know, I've always kind of thought of myself as an outsider. Like I'm not usually, I would say I'm a rule follower, but I'm outside the box. But it's much easier on yourself walking through life if you just try and get along with people. And yeah, these are guidelines to doing that. You can still be an oddball. You can still be an oddball.
I don't know any oddballs, did there?
Oddballs are the best. Like in the circus.
I feel like that's like that oddballs are the best.
I do want to say one thing, and I don't know how I almost made the Nazir a juggler.
Yeah.
Oh.
Do you have any feelings towards that one way or another?
Yeah, that's
I'll
right.
let somebody else talk, but I think that, you know, it could have worked as well as this does too.
Thanks, Kay.
Thank
Karen.
Well, I know.
Yeah, I just I mean, kind of thought maybe also the strong person, you know, like that was like Shimshon. But yeah, no, I was thinking just about in terms of the what we were just saying about like how you navigate, whether you follow the straight line with mitzvot or whether you kind of have to work them. I think there's a way in which what these texts tell us also is it's like they're just trying to figure it out. Like Nadav and Avihu, I think they tried to figure out what was the right way to bring fire, and they like kind of missed it, and Adam and Chava, like in our stories. I think there are a lot of ways that, Anyway, I think there are a lot of ways that that we have to work the mitzvot so that they become ours. It's like, you have to massage it, you have to breathe it in, you have to blow life into it for it to become actually meaningful and to be your own. So I think that's the process, that it's an amazing gift. But like you said, like Kay said, like it's heavy and there's a lot to figure out, and there are parts of it that are fire. And, I think breathing fire is about sort of what it's like sometimes, to figure out how to do it and how to make it, how to really make it rich in our lives. So, yeah, anyway.
Great. I love that. Well, I want to thank Beth. It's amazing. We Chavruta quite a bit, but this was particularly special and really certainly mind-blowing for me. And thanking all of you for coming and for being a part of our Chavruta. I'm going to turn this back to our Amen Institute founder and facilitator, Devere.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Thank you for just delighting us in the festivities of the circus this evening. And it's so beautiful. The book of Leviticus, the first sentence of it is that God spoke to Moses inside of the tent of meeting, inside of the Ohel Moed. And the last is that God spoke to Moses in the Sinai. And the first sentence of this book, Bamidbar, is that God spoke to Moses in the Sinai desert and at the Ohel Moed. And that tension that, like you described, is that the desert is a place in which everything is legally considered hefker, is ownerless, and a space where no one takes ownership of anything. It's there's powerlessness and an equalizing force inside of the desert in which everyone can kind of participate equally. And yet at the same time, this image of the Mishkan, of the temple, is one in which is highly elitist and highly exclusive, and all those unseen moments are distinct from. And so bringing out those tensions that are so powerful as to sensationalizing the everyday, and whether that creates an ickiness or diminishing the sanctity to something that which is perfunctory and performative, and that also carries that ickiness, but it's all within the same sense of the tension of being inside of a desert in which all of us perhaps live within a world in which there's so much of our lives that we can't take ownership over, or we have to live within a system that defines where we go and what we do, within a sense of our own little camp and our own little tent within that desert that allows us space to hold sanctity and to hold a spectacle that can uplift the everyday and uplift that which is separate from, and that which is out of reach from our lives. I wish everyone a joyous and Torah-filled week. We just left the mountain and we're back into the daily lives of the real world, but in that world we can still carry a little bit of the mountain as we march our way forward towards the promised land. I wish everyone
Circus tent.
Towards the circus tent, yes. Thank you everyone for attending, and this has been such a pleasure and such an honor to just bear witness to the Mullings of Mullen and to the beauty of Beth. Take care.
Okay.
Thank you, Devere.
To the
Thanks,
Bye.
Bronwen.
Yeah.